Good evening, everyone. I just want to thank everyone for joining us for the GAP Network's 2021 conference, Gaining Ground. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gretchen Addison, and I am the coordinator for the GAP Network. This year's conference title, Gaining Ground, was selected in order to offer hope and possibly inspiration for those who are grieving. As we gain ground in our journey, we meet new people who tend to experience the same type of loss. We can go to awesome conferences, and we can begin to find meaning and purpose in our lives again. The GAP Network, and that is through grief, advocating for prevention, was created to bring information and education, opportunities to advocate, networking, and we're here to support individuals who have lost a loved one to an overdose. And now we are expanding that to include a much larger reach. The GAP Network is going to undergo some very big changes in the next 2 months. And there will be rebuilding our website and updating our folders and materials. So I want to invite you to kind of check in with us over the next month or two, find out what we're doing and browse our resources and come grow with us. It's going to be a very exciting year. Well, the bottom line is we wouldn't be here tonight without our funders at the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. And here tonight to share a few words with us is the Chief of the Office of Prevention Services, Stacey. Hassan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, Gretchen. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. I am with the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, and I'm very pleased to be with you this evening. On behalf of Governor Mike DeWine, our director, Lori Chris, and my boss, who is the Deputy Director, Bobby Boyer. This movement that is the GAP Network began a long time ago. Actually, I was part of that very initial fledgling work in this area. And it's amazing to see how it's grown and how all of you and Prevention Action Alliance and your communities have gotten engaged in it. Just a couple of thoughts, very quick. You are taking action. By being on this call, you're taking action. By participating in groups locally, you're taking action. You are working to heal yourselves, your families, and your communities after incredible loss. And taking action at a time like that is just the hardest thing you'll ever do in your lives. And I know you know that. But I just wanted to leave you with one thought, and that is when you first experienced this loss, did you know where to turn? Did you know of a group like this? Had you ever heard of anything like this? You are those individuals who are now, sadly, some would say, but also, to your credit, you are those who can talk about this from an experience standpoint at this point in time. You're participating tonight, and in this event because it's something that is so incredibly near and dear to your heart. And I just encourage you to continue that work, to be willing to talk about it. We know that anything related to addiction is still incredibly stigmatized within society, and it will continue to be as long as we don't talk about it. So we have opened up that issue over the last 10 years, even over 20 years. But we have to continue to get it out there, not have it be anybody's deep, dark secret. It's about healthcare, and it's about folks getting the care that they need. And at this point, it's about healing. So thank you for being on this call. Gretchen.
Okay. In addition to serving as the Executive Director of Prevention Action Alliance, Fran is also a member of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Prevention Association of Ohio and the Ohio Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders Steering Committee, as well as a member of the Coalition for Healthy Communities and the Ohio Prevention Advocacy Network. Very busy. Fran, could you share a few words with us?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Gretchen. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Fran Gerbig, and I am the Executive Director of Prevention Action Alliance. And on behalf of the team at Prevention Action Alliance and the members of the GAP Network, I would like to welcome you to this year's GAP Network Conference, Gaining Ground. I'm glad you're here this evening. And for some of us, this is a hard place to be. Losing a loved one to an overdose is, as Stacey mentioned, just an incredible loss that unless you've experienced it, you can't really understand unless you walk in those shoes. And so I appreciate your willingness to join us tonight. Grief from an overdose loss is especially complex and it's often stigmatized, and the journey of grieving can take years. And I know that this grieving process is hard work. This event brings us together to see that we're not alone in our grief. It's estimated that 17 Ohioans are taken from us each day as a result of overdose death. That means that there are 17 more families staggering from the loss of their loved one every day and looking for information about what happened and how to address the grief that is felt with it. Years ago, there weren't any resources for grieving families, and that's why grieving families decided to unite together to create the GAP Network to encourage healing, support grieving parents, and advocate for prevention. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Stacey and the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services for their commitment to this work. And I would like to thank the GAP Network Advisory Council for their leadership and assistance in planning and preparing for this conference tonight. When the subject of substance misuse comes up in daily conversation, it's natural that we tend to look for a cause. We look for a moment or an event or a circumstance where things started to go the wrong way. And whether you're a family member who's grieving a loss, or a concerned community member, or a professional who's seen the damages of substance misuse and how it impacts families in our hometowns, we all share that common desire to make sure that our experience doesn't happen to others, and to do whatever we can do to prevent addiction from taking root in the people that we know and the people that we love. Research and experience has shown us that community-based prevention is the best, most effective way to combat substance misuse at the local level. But understanding good practice, knowing where to start, who to partner with, how to organize those efforts, that can be very overwhelming. Tonight, we'll learn more about the role that grief plays and its impact on families. Tomorrow, we'll learn how it can shape our efforts to advocate for prevention of substance misuse. This conference will begin to equip you with the tools and information to grieve effectively and how to involve your fellow community members in combating this epidemic of addiction. So thank you. Thank you again for joining us this evening for this important conference that addresses grief and how we can transform that grief to advocacy for prevention.
Thank you so much, Fran. At this time, I would like to introduce the GAP Advisory Council Member Chair, Ellen Schoonover, and she is going to share a few words with us and then introduce one of our two keynote speakers for this evening. Ellen?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience with that. I'm so glad you have all carved out your time to join us this evening for the GAP conference. 9 years ago, this coming May, on Mother's Day weekend, we lost our son, Matthew Schoonover, to an accidental overdose, only 1 day out of rehab. Facing an unimaginable journey before us, we were lost, scared, and uneducated about addiction. We needed two things: solace and comfort from those who had also experienced a tragic sudden loss, and purpose. The GAP Network offered us both. I've made treasured friends through the network and have learned much about grief through their conferences over the years. I've come to better understand the many faces of complicated grief that so many face with an overdose of a loved one. Paul and I have found purpose since Matt's death by understanding the value of advocacy, erasing stigma, educating, and changing society's perception of addiction gives us a greater purpose, so as not to let our son's death be in vain. It has enabled us to be a voice for him. So no matter where you are in your lost journey, I welcome you here tonight at the Gap Network virtual conference. I've had the privilege to hear all three of our keynote speakers in person, and I'm thrilled they will be presenting. Eleanor Haley will be presenting our first session. Eleanor holds a master's degree in counseling psychology from Loyola College in Baltimore, Maryland. She is one of the co-founders of the highly successful online grief community, What's Your Grief? Eleanor is a mental health professional who works with people coping with all types of complicated losses and life transitions. What's Your Grief was built as a resource offering concrete, practical, creative, down-to-earth, and relatable support founded on the values of psychoeducation and creative coping. It has grown to serve more than 5 million visitors each year. So we welcome you and thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. I'm sorry that we're not all together in one room, but it's nice that we're able to connect in this way. So that was a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And actually the way that this has worked out, our presentation tonight, is that Litsa and I will be tag teaming throughout. You're going to hear from us for a little bit, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but up until about 6 o'clock. And then you're going to get a little short break from us, and then we'll be back to wrap up our presentation. So with that, actually, Litsa is going to share her screen, and I'll just mention a few sort of housekeeping things before we get there. It was mentioned earlier when everybody was joining, but I just want to reiterate, for all of you who are joining from home, this is a webinar. When we do webinars, we are always sure to share this. So we can't hear or see you, which is great for a lot of people who have a lot of activity going on behind them or who want to join in their pajamas or what have you. But that means that we can't really connect by hearing from you in person. So we really ask now, if you haven't popped out the chat for your on Zoom, if you wouldn't mind doing that now. So if you don't know how to do that, what you do is you hover your mouse around, or if you're on a tablet, you click down at the bottom of your screen and you should see an icon. You should see a couple of icons, but the one we want you to click on is the one that says chat, and then pop it out. And it should come up, I think it defaults to the side of your screen. If you're on a tablet, it may take up your screen, so that's not ideal, but that's where we would love to have most of the conversation. And one other thing about the chat is that oftentimes when you open it up, it first defaults to saying, where you type your message in, it says to panelists, which would mean that only the panelists who you just saw on your screen can see your messages. If you don't mind, if you could click on that blue button and click it, and it will give you the option to say panelists and attendees. That way, everybody who is on the call right now will be able to see what you share. So throughout this presentation, we would love for you to share as much as you feel comfortable with. If you want to right now, feel free to share where you're joining us from, maybe who you're here remembering. Totally up to you. We totally respect people who don't want to share, but we always like to invite people to share as we get started, and then continue to use the chat to whatever your comfort level is throughout our presentation. There is a QA function. We don't mind if you put your questions in the chat. You can also use the QA as well. We'll try and keep an eye on both areas. So with that, I'm actually going to ask my co-presenter and co-founder of What's Your Grief, Litsa, to introduce herself. And then after that, I'll introduce myself, a little bit about What's Your Grief, not too much, and then we'll get started with the presentation.
Great, thanks, Elle. So my name is Litsa Williams. As Eleanor said, I'm one of the co-founders of What's Your Grief. I'm a clinical social worker, and I'll share a little bit more about What's Your Grief. But one of the reasons I'm so grateful that we're here tonight, and this is a topic talking about continuing bonds that we feel can be really helpful for anyone who's experiencing any sort of loss, But why being here with all of you and this group is really important and meaningful for me is that part of our work professionally and our careers has been working with individuals who are grieving. But part of the way that Eleanor and I really connected when we met as colleagues providing grief and bereavement support was that we had been through personal losses ourselves. I lost my dad when I was 18, and my sister, who was about 6 years younger than me, really struggled. We both, of course, really struggled, and she struggled with a very long-term heroin addiction. And her partner, who was like a member of our family when I was in my mid-20s, died of an overdose. And that was in 2004. And that was really in the early days of really looking at grief support for substance-related losses. And so early in my career, working in grief and loss, from early on, this was an area where I just felt there needed to be more attention, where we needed to learn more, where I was always looking for research and intervention and what do we do and how do we provide support. And though things have grown with time, there's still a long way to go in providing really the kinds of research and support that we need in thinking about substance-related losses and the grief that comes with them, as well as the support that we provide to individuals who are grieving to help them to find the tools that will hopefully reduce some of the substance use disorders that come up and the relapses that come up after losing a loved one. So this is definitely something that's really important to me personally and professionally. So I'm just really grateful to be here. And I will turn it over to Eleanor to share a little about herself, and then we will get into the details of our presentation.
Thanks, Lisa. And I'm not sure, Lisa, if you said it, but Lisa's background's in social work. My background is in counseling. And as she said, we met working as professionals, but like Lisa shared, we connected through our personal losses as well. I had experienced the death of my mother in early adulthood. And in our work that we were doing, we were working with families all throughout the state of Maryland at the time of a loved one's sudden and unexpected death. And so we were working with people in the very first days of their losses. And then we ran an aftercare program that provided support to people for 2 years after that. So we were really meeting people who were experiencing all types of losses at all different points in their grief. And so we were looking at things through a professional lens, but we were also always looking at things through a personal lens. And long story short, the way What's Your Grief came to be is that in our work, we were constantly coming up against this problem that we weren't finding the types of resources that we really wanted people to have, things that would help to normalize what they were experiencing, things that would help to educate people about different types of things that are associated with grief, different important concepts like the one we're going to talk about tonight. And so after complaining for a while that we weren't finding the stuff we wanted, we said, you know what, we don't have a lot of resources. We definitely don't have a lot of money or time, but I think we can probably start a blog with very little resources and just see what happens. And that's what we did. And just over the years, things grew. And so now, if you've never visited our website, we're whatsyourgrief.com. We have hundreds of free articles there. We used to have a podcast where you can still listen to all our older episodes. We have print resources. And another big part of what we do is our presentations like this, because there's just not enough information and psychoeducation and training for professionals out there about grief and about important concepts related to grief. So long story short, that's what brings us here today. And so in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started because we do have a lot we want to cover tonight. And again, please go ahead and continue to introduce yourself, comment, share in the chat as we go along. So we're going to be talking about continuing bonds, which some of you, if you're already familiar with continuing bonds, just let us say, yes, I'm familiar in the chat. So we have a good idea of who has already heard of this term before. But before we can really introduce the idea of continuing bonds, we think it's important to look at where our society, Western society in particular, has been in terms of how we conceptualize grief. So although people have been dealing with grief and loss since forever, right? Since the beginning of time, Our history of really studying it, researching it, theorizing it, looking at it through the lens of psychology, philosophy, things like that, it doesn't go back quite as far as you might think. In terms of the work that we do with in the field of psychology, and then there's another related field called thanatology, which is the study of death and dying. The first time we really see some theorizing and writing about grief in that academic sort of way is with our friend Sigmund Freud. Now, if you remember anything from Psych 101, I'm sure it is the name Sigmund Freud. And he was working back in the 1920s-ish, beginning of the 1900s. And he wrote about grief in his book on mourning and melancholia. And at that time, what we call depression today, he was using the word melancholia. So what he was really doing is contrasting the two experiences of mourning and what we now today would look at as depression. And in his writing, he talked a little bit about grief. And so there's a lot to say really about that, but that's not what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're not going to be doing an in-depth discussion of grief theory. Don't worry. But we did pull a quote from his writing here that kind of sums up some of how he looked at grief through his psychoanalytic lens, because he was the father of psychoanalysis. And so what he said was, to recover from grief, the word recover, you must express grief and detach emotionally from the deceased. So we see in our very beginning conceptualizations of grief here that he was really thinking that what we had to do was take the mental and emotional energy that we were investing in the person who died and detach it from that person and reinvest it in other parts of the world. So that's where we began. Now, interestingly enough, Freud was no stranger to loss. He had experienced quite a few losses in his life, and people who have read through some of his more personal writings have noticed that some of the writings look a little bit different than what is written in his professional writings. And so there's a quote that we always love to share from one of his letters that he wrote to a loved one who had just experienced a significant loss. And I'm going to read it to you today because it kind of ties into what we're talking about today. He said, although we know that after such a loss, the acute state of mourning will subside, we also know we shall remain inconsolable and will never find a substitute. No matter what may fill the gap, even if it be filled completely, it nevertheless remains something else. And actually, that is how it should be. It is the only way of perpetuating that love which we do not want to relinquish. So those words feel a lot more like what we're talking about today. But not everybody knew about Freud's personal letters way back when. So Freud got us started. And from there, we had almost a century, so leading up to about the 1990s, of theorists who were expanding on this idea of what is known as grief work. So they're called grief work hypotheses. And the idea of grief work is really that we dive into our grief. We have to really, really focus on it, work out all those unpleasant, distressing, and negative feelings until we can return to a state of maybe our baseline okayness, well-being, get rid of some of those more unpleasant emotions till we resume to a more positive state of mind. And many of these theories also implied with that there was kind of an end to grief. We got to a point where we were okay again and we moved forward. And so you may recognize one of the theories on here, down towards the bottom left here. You see those different stages of grief, and you may not recognize the one on the right, or you may, Worden's Task of Mourning. But those are just two examples of many, many, many grief work hypotheses that looked pretty similar and had these ideas of different stages and tasks that one moves through until we get to a point of our last task, right? So here we're expanding on that one that we just shared. Everybody knows, I think, probably on this webinar that what we're referring to here are the 5 stages of grief. And the reason we take a moment to really focus on this is because if people in our society know nothing about grief, the one thing they usually do know is the 5 stages of grief. And it's important, we always like to give credit where credit is due. We still owe Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who wrote about the 5 stages of grief, a significant debt of gratitude. Her work was very important, but there are some reasons why the fact that this is what everybody knows now, there are some reasons why that's kind of problematic and why it causes a lot of those myths and misconceptions out there about grief. The first issue is that this is a really incredibly nuanced theory. There's a lot people don't know about the 5 stages of grief. Things like people may not hit all the stages of grief, according to Kubler-Ross. Ideas like this doesn't encompass everything we experience in grief. Ideas like we may move forward and backwards in our grief. And so there was a lot that the authors of this theory had to say that people just don't know about. The problem is that it's packaged so neatly that people hear these stages and just think it's that simple. They just assume that they know. They just assume that this is what grief looks like, because I've heard these stages repeated so many times in so many different contexts. This must be true, right? The other problem is that this theory is kind of old school. It's one of those grief work hypotheses. And in many ways, people who really write academics, people who really study grief have moved a little bit beyond this. And maybe you still like to ascribe to these different stage or task theories, and that's okay. But it's important to know there are many different theories. There are many different ways that people conceptualize grief. And these task theories aren't necessarily the way grief actually is. And as people who have experienced grief, you might find that a little bit reassuring to know, oh, it's good to know that my grief didn't need to fit neatly inside this little box, or neatly inside these little theories. These theories, they bring us up to the 1990s, thereabouts. And to recap on the next slide, here are some of the reasons why what we're talking about moves a little bit beyond these theories. These theories gave the impression that they were pretty linear. In terms of how they described grief, they many times were sort of insinuating or leaving people with the impression that grief was universal. And I don't mean that grief isn't universal. Grief in general is universal, but that it looks the same universally, these different categories. And one thing that we know about grief is that it looks very different from person to person, but then from culture to culture, group to group, it looks very, very different. So trying to categorically describe grief can be really, really tricky. It leaves people with the impression that it's a process to be completed, that there is some sort of endpoint, that we are needing to move towards a place where we resolve our grief by severing our ties or moving on or getting over it, and that staying connected is potentially pathological, and that if you look outside of this box, if you don't fit into the theory, that's problematic. So it leaves us with a couple of impressions that just aren't true. I will make a note, because one of the bullet points there is that a lot of these task theories imply that there's an endpoint. I will make a note that some of the people who are still using these task models and using these stage theories have gone back and revised their final stages a little bit, or their final tasks, to say, you know what, actually that last task is to have this enduring connection and to continuously kind of process and connect with our loved one and process our grief. So there has been a bit of a revision, but in general, many of those stage theories really started with that notion. It's just that there have been revisions since. Some of the messages that people walk away from these different stage theories with, we've already kind of said, but these ideas that you have to let go, signs that it's time to let go. As people who are grieving, I'm not sure how long it's been since your loss, the death of your loved one, but people often are pushed to move on or get back to normal really, really fast. And even if it's a year after their loss, many times that feels very unreasonable and too soon. And also, you know what, I'm never going to be back to normal again because that person is gone. I've changed in so many ways. And so many of you may be able to relate to the frustration of hearing these messages. And then the way we work through these things is by talking, confronting, breaking ties to seek closure. So it leaves us with this very sort of confrontational, we're going to work sort of idea to get to run away from those scary and negative emotions. We want to note what ritual might look like under this paradigm, because something that we are going to be talking about is ritual. But under this paradigm, the idea of these 5 stages, the idea that we have to move on. There are a lot of ideas that rituals are about letting things go, moving through, moving on, finding closure. I don't know if people who are on this webinar how you feel about the word closure, but a lot of people who are grieving hate that word. You might be able to find closure with certain experiences, certain issues that you've had, but you're not going to find closure from your grief. That's not something that's going to happen for people. So that is a word that a lot of people do not love. So this brings us up to about the 90s. And it's so interesting that, that it took us this long to get to this point, because we're going to be talking about one of the theories that we, Lisa and I, think is probably the most intuitive grief theory. It's something that comes so natural to people that it just seems kind of crazy to us that it took until the 1990s for somebody to like really observe it and write it down and make it a theory, right? And when we explain to you what continuing bonds is, if you don't already know, you're probably going to be like, oh yeah, that's a part of something I already do. That's a part of my life already. That's a part of how I grieve already. So with that, as we talk, as soon as this clicks for you, we really invite you to share any ways that you see that this is something that you might experience in your grief. So we invite you to share any ways that you continue your bond with your loved one as we discuss this. One of the reasons why this is so important in this overall conference is that when we engage in things like advocacy, a lot of times that is a way that we continue our bond with our loved one. And so you're already sort of engaging in continuing bonds in that way. But many times our continuing bonds looks like much smaller, private, more private moments. So as we go, we invite you to share. So enter stage left, we have continuing bonds. And this is the original book written by Klaus, Silverman, and Nickman. There has been updates to the book since the first initial writing of it. It was these 3 authors, what happened was they were each observing different groups of people who were grieving. I think Klaus was observing, he was working with people in a Compassionate Friends support group. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Compassionate Friends group, but they're a national and actual international group of support groups for bereaved parents. And then other groups that the other people were working with include college-age women who had experienced the death of their, I believe, mothers. And I think maybe those were the main groups. But they got together and they were discussing what they were noticing. And they were sharing with each other that they weren't noticing what many of these theories that led them up to the 1990s said. And that is that they were not noticing that people were letting go, that people were moving on, that people were kind of cutting off this connection with their loved one. What they were noticing is that people were really wanting to stay connected with their loved one, that they were finding ways to stay connected, and that actually these people were still very healthy in their grief. It seemed for these people that it was a very normal experience, actually an experience that brought a lot of comfort for them. And so they said, you know what, this looks a little bit different than what all these theories have led us to believe. People are actually staying connected, and that is actually turning out okay for them. So they observed a lot of things, but some of the main points of what they observed include that bereaved children and bereaved adults were struggling to find a way of maintaining connection to the deceased. So they wanted that. That's something that they wanted. And some people do find it to be a struggle. And if you consider the fact that up until this point, it had been considered sort of pathological, you can understand why there might be some barriers to being able to do this, because there's always some fear. Am I wrong? Should I not be doing this? Does this mean I'm stuck? If I share this with anybody else, are they going to think that I'm crazy, or whatever word you want to use? Research interviews showed children created naturally a set of memories, feelings, and actions that kept them connected to their deceased parent. There are many different individual and unique ways that they connected, but some of the main ones that people noted were that they connect the relationship by dreaming of the loved one, by talking to the parent, by believing that that parent was always watching out for them, by keeping things that belong to the parent, so keeping objects. That's something I think a lot of people do, by visiting a grave or a place that they felt close to the loved one, and by frequently thinking about them. Another thing that was interesting that they noticed, and this will come up again when Lisa shares a little bit about some other nuanced parts of this, is that they found that the relationship that people have with their loved ones is ongoing. It's not static. So it changes and evolves, not exactly as it would if the person were still alive, but in a way that is very age appropriate. So if I experienced the death of my mother, I'll use a very real example. I did experience the death of my mother before I had children, when I was much younger. And at that time, my relationship with her was what it was as a young 20-year-old. Then I got married and I had kids, and my relationship started to look different with her. I started to think about, what advice would my mom give me as a parent? How did my mother parent? What are ways that I can replicate some of the things that she did that I love? And so my connection with her turned into a connection that that looked probably similar to the connection I would have had with her if she were still alive, looking to her memory for advice, looking to the things that she did, wondering what she was like as a young parent. And so the relationship, it evolves. And this can be true for somebody who experiences the death of a loved one at a very young age, as they grow up, and maybe they think about, what advice would my parent or my sibling give me on my graduation day? It might be that you experience the death of a spouse or a partner. And as you go through life, maybe you get to retirement, you start to think about, what would we have done in our retirement? Maybe I'll do something to continue that bond in that way. So this relationship, it doesn't stay static. It really evolves with us, which is an interesting and an important point if you think about how our grief evolves with us as well. As I already mentioned, that they found that in general, remaining connected seemed to facilitate both adults and children's ability to cope with the loss and the accompanying changes in their lives. These connections provided solace, comfort, and support, and eased the transition from the past to the future. So in general, we can't say that for every single person that's true, but in general, these connections were actually really helpful and really comforting to people. So this is a paradigm shift for people. Though it may seem intuitive as we're talking about it now, though it may seem intuitive because it's something that you already do in some ways in your grief. And though I even read a quote to you from Freud's letter that really kind of parallels this idea, it was, and for many people still is, a paradigm shift. There was the notion that we did move on from our loved ones. And as you may experience as you go throughout the world, there are many people who still think that about grief. I think once you go through grief, you might feel a little bit differently, though certainly not always. But I think many people do still hold this belief. And when you think about it, if you consider the fact that for decades, we only had these models that left us with the notion that that's what happens, it's so frustrating when it happens to us today, but you can kind of see why. That was the paradigm we were living under for a really, really, really long time. And it's only been about 20 to 30 years since people have been out there saying like, wait, no, at least in our society. So you can see how this has sort of changed things a little bit, but very recently. Here are some examples that people have shared with us. Over the years, people have shared so many examples. And in our work, I think this is the one thing I love hearing the most from people. It are those unique and individual ways that people stay connected with their loved ones. But this was just a time we asked people on, I think, Facebook, how they stayed connected with their loved ones. And Sharon shared that her daughter died in an accident at 16. Her favorite dessert was cheesecake, which they still have on our birthday after 26 years. Sandra shared that her dad always cried at the greeting cards that she gave him for special occasions. He's been gone 5 years, but she still gets him a birthday card gets him a card for his birthday, Christmas, and Valentine's Day. I love that one. And when we get to the holidays, one of the suggestions that we often hear from other people and share with people is that when you see that gift that your loved one, that you would have bought for your loved one, you know, maybe you still pick it up and then you donate it or give it to somebody else. And that's a way to stay connected and to continue that bond and to really cope with something that can be very triggering and upsetting over the holidays or around their birthday. The next one, it took me over a year after my son Luke passed away before I could bring myself to bake a pecan pie, his favorite. Now I bake several on Thanksgiving and give them away. It helps me feel close to my son. This one is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, in a few minutes, Lisa's going to talk about how continuing bonds may relate a little bit to timing. And so here, what was shared was that it took a while for this person to get to the place where they could do that. But eventually, the things that maybe they were even avoiding started to bring them some more comfort. And they were able to face those things. So they were able to get to that place, but it took time. Another thing that we love about this is that the pies are given away. So that's a way to share that person's memory, maybe with people who never knew the loved one or who are also remembering that person and grieving them, a way to help them to continue that bond. And then finally, every morning I drink my first cup of coffee out of my late husband's coffee cup. So something so simple, so quiet, so private can be a way that a person can really engage in a way of continuing bonds. And it's kind of like a ritual, right? Daily to do this thing that helps me to connect to my loved one. So again, if anybody has anything that they are willing to share now, please do share. Make sure that your chat says to all panelists and attendees. We love to hear how people see this concept playing a role in their lives. Uh-oh, I see that Jeff Prost is doing a bit of a little tango here. So all of this said, I know I think I maybe have been giving grief work a terrible rap and saying it's all wrong, but we're not fully voting all these theories that preceded continuing bonds off the island. That's not the idea that we want to leave people with. There is a lot of important work and a lot of helpful ideas that come along with many of these theories. And really what the people who spoke about continuing bonds wanted to have happen was to look at this in addition to everything that we all already knew. So, okay, yes, all that work is great, but maybe we need to consider how our relationship is ongoing. And what happened, as I mentioned, was that some of those theorists did go back and revise their final task or their final stage to include the idea that we stay connected with our loved ones. An example of this, if you're familiar with David Kessler, maybe you've even seen him speak. He worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. He just recently wrote a book about the sixth stage of grief, which is meaning. And much of that has to do with the meaning we make from our losses and continuing our bond with our loved ones. So that's just one example. This is not an either or situation. All they wanted to do, they say, is say that interacting with, I'll read this quote, we wanted to show that interacting with the dead could be normal rather than pathological. The move from pathology to normal has been interpreted as if we were moving continuing bonds from the harmful list to the helpful list for the evaluation of grief. That is not what we had in mind when we wrote. So they weren't saying all of a sudden, like, everything that you know is wrong. And also now you need to, all you grief therapists, all you counselors, all you support group leaders, you need to go out and force everybody to do continuing bonds, tell everybody to do continuing bonds so they can start to feel better. That's not what they wanted to have happen. All they wanted to do was say that it's not pathological. It's not wrong. It's very normal. And we can't prescribe continuing bonds to people, right? All we can do is support and help people in finding the way that they continue their bond with their loved one. So with that, as I promised, I'm going to pass off to Lisa, and she's going to talk a little bit about some of the more nuances, some of the other nuances to this concept, and specifically talk about timing, as I had mentioned. So thanks.
Thanks, Elle. And thank you so much to everyone who has shared in the chat the amazing ways that you continue bonds. I think a lot of these are really exactly what we're talking about, incredibly touching and things that are really, really personal, which we're going to talk a little bit about how some of these personal connections that we have are so incredibly meaningful and comforting in grief. Before we get there, one of the things that I think is really important for us to talk about is how timing is part of continued bonds. And as Eleanor just read, the continuing bonds theorists, they were really cautious in saying we don't want to measure someone's grief and tell them that they're doing grief right or doing grief wrong if they're continuing bonds. And part of that is because continuing bonds is such a private and individual process, and the timing of that continuing bonds and the way that it takes shape and evolves over time is going to look different for everyone. And it's going to, look different for even people who've experienced the same loss. One of the things that we think can be helpful to remember, and that we've seen in the research and the literature about grief, is that early on after a loss, what people are often craving and looking for as a way to kind of continue their connection to their loved one is very physical. It's trying to stay close to their loved one in the ways that we were almost used to having a connection to our loved ones. So early on in grief, you might still be in that place, or you might remember really, really valuing every object that belonged to your loved one, not wanting to move things because, that was really important, really trying to kind of seek that physical proximity. And we liken this, and actually John Bowlby, who's an attachment theorist, sort of talked about both what child development looks like when kids are really, really young, from when they're born and when they grow up. And then he talked also about grief as adults. So it's interesting, he looked at both ends of the spectrum, sort of when we lose a loved one. And one of the things that can be helpful is sort of thinking about this evolution that happens in our connection to our loved ones as we're grieving, as something similar to what happens when babies grow up and we look at their attachment to their parents, which is that early on, babies really want that physical attachment, right? So you imagine that, you can certainly imagine a baby who, when they go into a new place with their mom, they are holding on tightly to their mom. They don't want anyone else to hold them. They feel this physical proximity. That's what makes them feel safe. That's what allows them to know that mom is right there, is that when they can see mom, they know that they're connected with mom. And over time, as kids get a little bit older, kids are able to kind of create what becomes a symbolic psychological representation of mom, right? They start to learn over time that even when mom isn't right there, she still comes back later, or I'm still able to feel safe because I know that even maybe now if we go to a new place, I can go into the other room and play with my friends, and I can sort of still psychologically feel close and secure, knowing that mom loves me, that mom will come back later, and that's kind of part of healthy development as a child. What we look at in grief actually looks sort of similar, which is early on, that physical proximity is what we're desperately holding on to when a loved one is gone. We're looking for every object. We're seeking to be close in that way. But as time starts to pass, oftentimes people start to realize that their connection to their loved one, it doesn't have to come through those physical objects. It can come through that psychological closeness that we develop, that set of memories, that set of connections that are the things that we will do in memory of our loved one, or that our loved one loved, or that our loved one taught us. And with time, slowly, we're actually able sometimes to let go of some of those things that we were physically holding on really tightly and move to some of those psychological things. So when we're thinking about physical proximity, oops, my goodness, sorry about that. I've just skipped us ahead a little bit. When we're talking about physical proximity, we're talking about some of those things that I mentioned, like listening to their voices, looking to touch, smell, hear things. That's what brings comfort. Early on, this is when sometimes people will think maybe they're feeling a little bit like they're, you know, feeling a little like they're going crazy, because they will think that they see their loved one on the street, or they will, you know, do things that actually early in grief are quite normal, but can look a little bit like hallucination sometimes, but it's a normal part of very, very early grief, and going to those places. And then over time, that shifts, and we see in people's grief that they start to feel more comfort in some of these more symbolic things, these psychological connections, some of the things that everyone's writing about. Writing the book that you'd planned to write together is such a good example, right? Picking up a hobby that they enjoy, doing things in their memory. So we're able to shift. But this continued bond and connection, it becomes a lot easier for us to think about how we'll maintain these when we've moved to a place of our grief coming through that psychological proximity. So not surprisingly, some of the studies that they've done, and this was a study done with widows, found that in those first 4 months or so, it was really hard for them to continue to apply continuing bonds after their loss. But after that 4 months, it became a bit easier for widows in this study to be able to engage in some of these continued bond rituals, because we see that that shift is starting to happen, where we're learning what are those psychological connections that will allow us to forever feel that legacy and connection to our loved ones. So that's sort of before the last piece we want to talk about before we take a break is that this psychological proximity, that when we begin to feel it, that this is the time when we start to oftentimes create little rituals that can be really important to us and meaningful in grief. Oftentimes, when we talk about the idea of ritual in grief, people will think about things that are more kind of public, things like funeral rituals and memorial rituals and things that are collective. And there were some psychologists at Harvard Norton and Gino, who you see here, who were really interested in what rituals are meaningful for people and actually bring them comfort in their grief. They wanted to see what rituals actually help to ease some of the pain of people's grief. And in their interviews, when you read the interviews with Norton and Gino about this research, they said, we were really expecting, what we were predicting was that it was going to be funeral rituals, memorial rituals, the things that brought people together to celebrate their loved one and to allow them to sort of feel supported with other people. But when they did multiple studies and started to look at what they found that the rituals that brought people the most comfort and that were actually the rituals that people connected with helping to ease the deepest pain of their grief were actually personal rituals. They were individual, and they actually were not some of the communal rituals that were expected. So what they found was that 90% of the rituals that people thought were the most important and meaningful in their grief were private. 95% of them were secular, and that was that adjusted for whether or not the individual was religious or spiritual or not. So this wasn't just that they happened to have a group of people who didn't have a strong religious belief system. What they found was that even those with a strong religious belief system who did engage in some rituals and traditions that were connected with that religion still identified the ones that were the most comforting as the secular rituals that they had created. And 95% of them were actually rituals that were done individually. They weren't rituals that were done with other people or collectively as a group. So this research, they're the first to say, really surprised them. But I think for us as individuals who are grieving or supporting people who are grieving, it can be a really important way to remember that these little things that we're doing are normal, they're natural, and they are a huge source of comfort and ongoing support, even when sometimes they're the things that, you know, we feel like are a little bit, sometimes that we're not sure if other people are doing the same things, or we feel weird about talking with them. During this year of COVID and the restrictions of the pandemic, and a time when many people did not get to have the funerals and memorials that they wanted to have, these little personal rituals have become even more important. So we say that to really think about supporting these rituals for yourself, but also for family, for other people who you may be meeting and talking to who are new in their grief, that there's a huge value in normalizing these. It's also important to remember, as Eleanor described, that what is meaningful for us in these rituals and traditions that we create. Oh, I'm sorry, let me get that 1 minute. Apologies. One of the things that we want you to remember is that just because you've set a ritual or a tradition or a continued bond that's really meaningful right now, it may not be the same ritual or tradition or continued bond that is meaningful in 3 years or in 5 years or in 15 years or in 25 years. These will often change and grow with us as our relationship with the person who's died continues to change in the ways Eleanor described. There's a concept in grief that is known as re-grief, which is the idea that we re-grieve at all different developmental stages throughout childhood and even across the lifespan in adulthood. So being attuned to the ways that as we evolve and as we grow, we may want to explore new ways and new connections and new things. We can talk about that as a family. Sometimes something that can happen is that we become so attached to the ritual that we created early on that even when it doesn't quite fit anymore, even when it doesn't quite work anymore, that continued bond feels a little bit off. We feel like, is this a betrayal to my loved one or to my grief if I decide to change this ritual or adjust or do something new? And we want everyone to remember that a normal part of that evolution of grief is that those things will often evolve and change for us. So we want to keep that in mind. And if you have kids in your life, this is even more important, because what's meaningful to a 12-year-old who creates this connection with their brother who died or their dad who died at age 12, that connection is going to look different at 15, at 18, at 30, at 50. And so we want to help to normalize it for kids too, because it's especially important for them when they're going quickly through developmental stages and may be growing in and out of certain connections over time. So with that, we're right at 6 o'clock, and we're going to, in the second half, we're going to be transitioning into talking about some barriers and some concrete ideas for continued bonds and connections that can build from this. But we will be we'll be passing over for a little break that will happen now, and then we'll come back after that to finish.
Well, I ate a very quick dinner so before we got started again. I wanted to just share some information on Litsa. Had I known they were going to be presenting together, I would have shared her bio at the same time. But I'm going to go ahead and share a little of her background, even though we've already had the privilege to hear her. Litsa received her master's degree in clinical social work from the University of Maryland School of Social Work, as well as a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Warwick, United Kingdom. Though much of the value in Eleanor and Litsa's work comes from their professional expertise between the two, They have lost parents in early adulthood, experienced the traumatic brain injury of a sibling, the substance use disorders of immediate family members, divorce, and the loss of a loved one to an overdose. They strongly believe that their work is strengthened by the intersection of their personal and professional experiences with grief and loss. So with that, we welcome the ladies back, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ellen. And I am going to go ahead and share my screen again, and then Eleanor will pick back up for the first half here. Oh, slowly loading.
I'll just go ahead and start talking, assuming that the presentation will catch up to us. So in the first half, we talked a little bit about what continuing bonds is. And hopefully, as we discussed, you were able to reflect on what role, if any, continuing bonds plays in your life and in your grief and in your ongoing relationship with your loved one. Some of you may think that this comes very easy to you. It may feel very natural, very intuitive, while others may feel that it hasn't been as easy, or that you have felt a little more tentative about continuing bonds. And so we just wanted to talk a little bit about maybe some of the barriers that could exist for people, because if we are able to acknowledge the barriers, then sometimes we're able to find ways to work around them. And then we're going to talk about just some tips, some ideas. We'll talk about a few things that we've seen people do to continue their bonds, some suggestions that we have sometimes for coping on special days, things like that. And we are continuing to invite you to share anything that you have to add in the chat here. So this is a very dry slide that we're sharing with you. But in the first half, we talked a lot about stage theories, and we explained to you why we don't necessarily think they work. And why continuing bonds shifted that paradigm. So we want to present to you the model that we like. As I said, there are so many different models, and so you might like a different model, and that's okay too. But the model that we love is the dual process model, which is this graph up here that you're seeing. I don't know if I would call it a graph, whatever, diagram. We like the dual process model combined with continuing bonds. And the dual process model also informs how we talk about coping, but just really briefly to summarize the dual process model, what they said, the people, Strobe and Shute are the authors of the dual process model. And by the way, if anybody wants access to references or resources related to this presentation, we'll provide our email at the end. So you can always email us and be like, what was that reference? Or what was that theory or whatever question you have. So what they said was that we don't love the grief work hypotheses is actually what they said. They had a lot of qualms with the grief work hypotheses. And they said that it doesn't quite explain what actually happens in grief. It's just not a complete picture. And what they proposed is that grief is this ongoing thing that happens a lot in the beginning, for the first months, years after our loss, and then again throughout our lifespan. And they talked about how when we're grieving, there's a lot we're doing, right? We're not able to do what some of the grief work models said, and that we just like dive in and focus only on our grief, because guess what? Life doesn't stop for our grief. Unfortunately, we all wish that it did, so we could have a little bit of time to catch our balance, but it doesn't. And so there's still work, there are still kids, there's still bills that need to be paid. And when we experience a big significant loss in our life, there's also all these secondary losses that happen that relate to things like practical things like our finances, and things like identity, things like our who are we now, and things that relate to maybe our belief system, and so on and so forth. And so there's just so much that we are coping with in terms of coping with the actual grief of that loss, and then all the other stressors. And so what Strobe and Shute said was that we really have to just go back and forth between dealing with our loss, focusing on our loss, and focusing on the rest of our life, all these other stressors, all these other losses. And we go back and forth all the time throughout our grief. And so one minute we may be really focused on our grief, and then we have to get up and go to work, and we have to focus on these other stressors. And so what they said was that we oscillate between focusing on these different things. And they also created a little space for what they talked about as being a little bit of avoidance of our grief. And so we never want to advocate for chronic avoidance, because when you use avoidance as a way of coping all the time, that can cause a lot of problems. But if you sometimes take a break from your grief, it can be helpful to get a little bit of space, to maybe do something that helps you boost your just general well-being. It may be that you need to avoid your grief to get through a different challenge or task or get through your day. And so they acknowledge that we oscillate back and forth, and sometimes we just need to take a little break from our grief. So we love this model. And, you know, one of the barriers I think we already shared is that there were all these other models that didn't necessarily support continuing bonds. And so this model, along with continuing bonds, we think works a little bit better. With that model, we'll also share, we have a little conceptualization for coping. And the reason we share this right now is because one, coping is such an important thing in our grief. And two, how we continue our bond is a way of coping a lot of the time. That is how we cope with grief sometimes. And so that it's relevant to talking about continuing bonds. And just like with the dual process model saying we need to shift back and forth between what we're focusing on, we believe that there's a lot of coping that we use to really face our loss and to cope with those really tough thoughts and emotions and maybe really distressing memories related to our grief, things like guilt, regret, anything that's really causing us a lot of pain. And we also think that there's the coping that we use maybe during those breaks to boost our well-being. And our well-being coping can also really help us to cope with our grief. And so we always think about coping as being something much bigger than what do we do to just focus on our grief. We go to a support group, we go to a therapist, but what else do we do to cope with all the other stuff that is going on to boost our well-being and to continue that bond with our loved ones? So we think it's important to share that with everybody now. A couple of the barriers that we really want to point out that people may be experiencing and therefore maybe want to think about, okay, how do I cope with this barrier if I want to continue my bond with my loved one? We'll share now. The first is pressure to move on. And we shared here a comment we received. Really quickly, I'll explain where this came from. We on Instagram do something called Photo a Day Grief Photo Challenge. So every once in a while, we'll say for the next 30 days, we're going to give you a prompt every day and ask you to go out and photograph something about your grief, about your relationship with your loved one that relates to that prompt. And people will share their photo and they'll share a caption that explains it. Actually, one is, we're doing one right now. We're in the middle of it. So if you're interested, check out our Instagram. But this person who commented here had been sharing her grief photos, and she received some feedback from people, and I'll share the comment. I'll read the comment right now. I stopped sharing too. This was actually piggybacking off someone else who had a similar experience. I felt like some of the comments I was getting made me feel like I was doing it to seek attention. Totally not what I wanted. Maybe it's hard to, as my son would have turned 25 this month, almost 3.5 years since I've given him a hug. So people have all sorts of opinions about what you should be doing in your grief and where you are in your grief. And maybe, oh, you're not really still grieving like that. This is just for attention. And so people can feel a lot of pressure. And when you're feeling that pressure to move on, are you then going to be comfortable sharing, this is how I am staying connected? Some people will. Some people will say, you know what? I'm good. I'm doing what I have to do. This is how I continue my bond, and it's actually really helpful. Some people will feel empowered to do that, but many people won't, especially people who don't know about these concepts and who then turn inward and say, am I wrong for doing this? Am I just seeking attention? Well, I'll point out, if somebody's seeking attention, a lot of times it's because they need that support, they need that love, and they need people to see their grief. But a lot of times people do question themselves. So that's one of the big ones that we see. Another one that's important is that many times people feel like they want to connect with their loved one through things like memories, photographs, videos, talking about their loved one. And they find that the other people who were closest with that loved one are unwilling to go there. And there are a lot of reasons why this might be. One, it might be that they're facing those same questions about whether they should be doing that. What does that mean about their grief? Another that we often hear is that some people just don't feel ready. Remember what Lisa shared about the fact that timing can really impact how a person feels about connecting with memories. Some people feel like, I can't go there because it's too painful. And the hope is that they'll get there in time. One that we do want to point out relates to kids. So if you know a child who's impacted by the same loss you're grieving, or another loss, frankly, sometimes parents feel, or caregivers feel, I can't talk about this loss or the loved one with the child because it will upset them. And what some of the survey research that we've seen shows is that really, when kids grow up and share about their experience, they say, I wanted to talk about my loved one more. I wanted more memories, but there was just this silence in the house, and the parents will share the same thing. So both people are saying, we wish there had been more dialogue about it. And because each was worried about upsetting the other, there wasn't. And so oftentimes there's this silence because people are just afraid of causing trouble or rocking the boat or upsetting people. Sometimes if a person was really young when the person died, people will assume that they don't have any memories of them, so they won't grieve or they won't want to continue that bond. And that's also not necessarily true. Many people who didn't, let's use the example of a child whose parent died when they're younger. Many times people who experience a loss when they were too young to remember will continue to grow up and want to fill that space in and say, who was this person? What were they like? What are your memories of them? So I can connect with them in this way. How am I like this person? So there's a lot of assumptions sometimes that kids won't want to have these memories, won't want to continue their bonds. And that's not necessarily true. So whenever possible, we encourage people to attempt an open dialogue. Respect people if they're not quite there yet, but at least maybe try and see what happens. Different grief styles can certainly contribute to a lot of misunderstanding and grief. Grief is it's unique to the individual. It is so different from person to person. What we know is that some people they want to talk about their loss right away. They want to talk about their loved one. They are really emotional. They want to express their emotions, explore their emotions. While other people are maybe more hands-on doer type of people. There's actually a theory that supports this that says, the more emotional, people more focused on their emotions are what we call intuitive grievers. And people who are more hands-on doer, action-oriented people, more focused on their thoughts, are what we call intuitive grievers. And instrumental grievers, sorry. And so oftentimes when these two people get together, there's a lot of misunderstanding because they're like, well, I want to talk about my grief. I want to talk about my loved one. And the other person's like, no, I want to go out and maybe get involved and do something or plan a really great memorial, or they want to actually be more hands-on in their grief. And there's sometimes a conflict there because one person fills their needs in a different way than the other. And people don't always understand that you're working toward the same end. You're just doing it very differently. So that can be one that can get in the way a lot of the time. As Lisa shared when she talked about how we feel sometimes that we need to hold on very tight to that person's physical presence, really trying to establish that physical proximity. A similar thing is that sometimes we feel like we need to hold on very tight to the pain because that's what's going to keep us connected. And we don't recognize that no matter what we do, we are always going to have a space for that person in our lives, in our hearts, and in our minds. And that connection doesn't necessarily need to be through such intense pain, that it can also be through really comforting, warm, and positive memories. Now, we're not saying that pain is optional after a loss at all, but we are saying that sometimes people get to a point where they almost feel guilty, feeling okay, maybe having a laugh about their loved one or sharing a positive memory, or saying to themselves, you know what, I'm carrying them forward in a different way, because they feel like if they're not really tapped into that pain, that they're not honoring their loved one in the proper way. And so sometimes it takes a while to get to that place where we can say, you know what, my grief still is here, but it's filled a lot more with positive and warm and comforting memories than it was previously.
And just one thing I'll add to that, Elle, as you're talking about it, because I was just talking with a group this morning where this came up, and a space where it can also be important is that sometimes when there is guilt and intense guilt around a loss, and when we know that oftentimes with substance-related deaths that there can be many feelings of guilt, and a lot of guilt that needs to be processed and worked through, and self-forgiveness to be found. But that sometimes there can be a feeling that the pain of grief and the continuing that guilt in its most burdening form can sometimes be a form of self-punishment that people will use. They'll feel like they don't deserve to let that go. And in that, sometimes don't realize that by holding on to those things, it takes up space that could actually allow for other types of bonds and those other types of connections that are there. So I just think, again, specifically, this can take a lot of shapes, but because guilt can be such a significant part of grief, it's one to keep in mind. And Deb, thank you for sharing what you just shared in the chat, because I imagine that other people can relate to that, that feeling caught off guard by feelings of happiness while grieving, in the times of not having that person there. So I imagine you're not alone in that.
And I think what that illustrates so well is that life just becomes a mix of paradoxes after you've experienced loss, where you are often finding yourself feeling two things at the exact same time, and having that flexibility to know that it's okay and possible to experience two things at the same time can really help people in their grief. And really with continuing bonds, because quite often the moments when we feel closest to our loved one, on the one hand, we feel the comfort of that closest. Maybe it's an important day, a special day, a wedding, a milestone. So we have, on the one hand, this happiness, this gratitude, this fulfillment, whatever it feels like for you. And on the other hand, there's always going to be that sadness that the person isn't here to share it with you. And so it's important to note that these things are often all happening at one time, and that's very normal and okay. The next, I think we just have maybe one more to share. So too much too soon. Lisa talked about the timing piece, and we talked about the comment that sometimes people are not able to continue bonds in a certain way initially. And sometimes people really dive in to continuing bonds in a way in the beginning that becomes too much. We're online for the most part, and we've seen a lot of people start pages, websites, Instagrams, blogs, wanting to really document their experience and document their grief. But what they found was that they were receiving a lot of comments. They felt the need to keep sharing, even on dark days for them. And it became really too much and very, very overwhelming. And it can sometimes distract a person from even being able to focus on their grief. The organization we worked for had a volunteer program, and many of you are working in advocacy. So I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of times we want to get involved. We want to be ready to help. We want to change how things are for the next person who comes along and faces grief, or we want to prevent someone from experiencing that grief. And that comes from a very good place, and it's often a way we continue our bond. But sometimes we find once we're in it, that it is very overwhelming and it is too much all at once. And so being able to really take care of ourselves, engage in that self-care, and having that awareness of when maybe we've gotten a little too involved and need to pull back, and not feeling guilty pulling back, because sometimes once we're in it, we feel like, oh gosh, we can't pull back now because now we're connected with people and now we're helping people. But hopefully people will understand when you need to take space, because that will help you to come back stronger and better able to help to support others and to change the world in whatever way you need to. So that's one that I think people are often realizing after they get involved a little bit, or after they start continuing bonds in a certain way. So we're advocating for a little awareness as you're moving through your grief always. Finally, one thing that came from the writers of the Continuing Bonds book is a note that continuing bonds isn't always for everyone. So I'm going to read the quote. "We must remain cognizant that while some grievers may find comfort in continuing bonds, others will find them unnecessary. I have reported a few cases, mostly from my psychotherapy practice, in which the bond with the living child was so loaded with pathological elements that when the child died, the parents in effect left the child behind, and after some difficult therapeutic work, rebuilt their lives without continuing interaction with the child." So there will be times when a continuing bond doesn't work for someone. It doesn't feel right for someone. It's important to note, even though we hear people say we don't speak ill of the dead, and when somebody dies, all of a sudden everything was roses, in reality, what we often see is that relationships that had conflict or trouble in life, that conflict still needs to be resolved, even though the person is not here to help us resolve it with them. And so conflict carries over, and often relationships that were troubled in life are troubled in death and in grief. And there are things that we need to do to find peace. And now it becomes even harder because there's no one on the receiving end of that peacemaking. So sometimes continuing bonds doesn't work. Of course, there are also other relationships where it just won't work, or it's not appropriate, rather. An example might be if you had an abusive partner. After that person dies, there's a lot a person would probably need to work through, but continuing the bond with the person who died is probably not going to bring that comfort. It's more going to be working through many of the experiences they had while that person was alive, and their feelings about their death and their feelings about themselves. So it's not going to be the continued bond that gets them through that loss most of the time. So it is important to note that this isn't always going to be right for everybody. And maybe it's just not right for somebody at a certain time, and it will be right for them someday. And that's why we can't prescribe continuing bonds. That's why we can only support people in establishing and developing and continuing their own bonds with their loved one. So with that, I think I'm going to hand off to Lisa to talk a little bit about how we can continue bonds. How do we support ourselves and other people in doing that? And maybe what are some of the little things that we can do?
Yeah. And as we get into talking about this, I think hopefully we're going to, share some ways to think about this, and just some things if you feel like you're a person who could use a bit of support with it, or if you may be in a position where you're supporting and mentoring others and helping them to think about how they can grow their bond. We'll talk about some ideas. One thing I also want to note with this that isn't in exactly here in what class's quote is speaking of here. There's so many wonderful ways to continue bonds. It's also important to note that occasionally people develop a continued bond that is in fact a connection with their loved one, but it's not always a healthy connection. And this is something that I will say I didn't really take time to reflect on until I was working with a client who lost his dad as a teenager. And he was 15 when his dad died. And as he got a little bit older, and the memories that family and friends and his dad's friends shared were all very focused on his dad sort of being a big partier and being kind of the life of the party. His dad didn't die of a substance related cause. It was something completely unrelated, but his dad had been somebody who definitely had a good time in his life using substances with a lot of people. And as a 15-year-old, he heard a lot of that. By the time I was working with him, he was in his mid-20s, and he was trying to deal with a lot of things around his grief that he hadn't before, but he himself had developed a pretty significant substance use disorder himself. And one of the things that he identified very strongly and vividly remembering is that when he started drinking and using other substances after his father's death, he in many ways did it as something that he felt like was a connection to his dad. He felt like it was something that connected him with those stories that his dad's friends and siblings and other people had told him, and felt like as he was growing older and being more interested in the kind of relationship that a child has with an adult parent, more of an adult to an adult relationship rather than just a child to adult relationship, that he felt like that was sort of an adult thing to do, that he could share at his dad, that he knew his dad had done and maybe would help him feel close to his dad. So one of the things that we always want to keep in mind is that though continuing bonds can be absolutely an incredibly meaningful connection in so many ways, that we also want to keep an eye out, especially if there are kids, if there are children of your loved one who died of a substance use disorder, or siblings, that sometimes that logical decision-making that happens during the teenage years isn't the logical decision-making of an adult, that there are some leaps that get made there and some desire for connection that can cause real risks around substance use. And so it's an important thing for us to keep in mind, and is certainly not a barrier to healthy continued bonds. So with that, we're going to give you, just a couple of kind of sum it up reminders and then some specific ideas. So if you're struggling and feeling like maybe people are not giving you that positive reinforcement when you're sharing your continued bond, or aren't open to it, or are, kind of pressuring that thing, reminding yourself that there is good theory and research that this is actually a really healthy thing to do, be able to continue that connection, and maybe share information about that. There's great information. There's articles online about continuing bonds theory. It might be something that you want to share on your social media, or, share with other people as a reminder to yourself and others that this way of grieving is a really normal and healthy way to grieve. Keep your eyes open to it. And I know that this may sound silly. It may feel like the impact that our loved ones have on our lives are really obvious. But many times there are lots of little things that in our everyday lives are things that we do, feelings we have, ways we interact in the world that are connections to our loved ones. And being thoughtful about those things, whether it's just taking a moment of pause in your own day, a little kind of private ritual, if you realize that you're listening to music that your loved one loved, or using an expression they always used, or doing one of those things that they did, to take a moment to acknowledge that to yourself, but also potentially, if you're comfortable and you are a kind of person who in your grief you like to share, of getting comfortable sharing that with other people, of being able to kind of say that to a person around you or someone nearby. Because as we normalize that these little continued connections exist, that continuing our bonds and talking openly and mentioning it when we hear a song on the radio that was our loved one's favorite song, and feeling comfortable saying that to a coworker or to someone else, it helps to slowly change that culture around how we talk about people who've died, and how as a society we slowly start to realize that it's okay to talk about and remember and bring into our daily conversation the ways that those who aren't here with us anymore are still impacting our day-to-day life. And it helps everyone to slowly get more comfortable with that. It's sort of its own, sometimes little mini type of advocacy when we notice those moments and share them with other people. If you think that there are barriers that we've talked about today that really jumped out, and you thought, oh, yep, this is something that is coming up for me, this is probably one of the things that is a challenge for me in trying to continue that bond, either a relational one, maybe with family or other people, that is coming up for you, or if it's something that's a little bit more personal, spending a little time to strategize about how you might be able to address some of those things. If you're in a group or a grief group, or work with a counselor, that can be a great space. If not, just spending some time with it yourself, journaling about it, talking with other family members, if that's where the challenge lies, which is our next tip here, is to start that conversation with friends and family about continued bonds. If you feel like it's something that maybe you haven't collectively been doing as much as you would like as a family or with others, to do that. what we sometimes find is that in that acute time immediately following a loss, there can be certain relationships that get a little bit more distant, not through any malicious intent or falling out or anything like that, but just because the space that you're in may not have allowed you to continue connections, and other people may have struggled to know how to. So if you had a partner who died, a parent who died, a child who died, and during that time, maybe some of their friends drifted away a little bit. You just didn't keep in touch with their friends. You didn't, you weren't able to keep that connection, especially because maybe they weren't directly connected with you. And now maybe you're looking to continue bonds. You might want to reach out to them and say, hey, I've been thinking a lot about stories that I don't know about this person. I would love to see if maybe you all have some pictures that I don't have, if there are some continued connections there that might happen through people who have become a little bit further removed with that time immediately following the loss. It can be a great way to connect. And then, remember, as we said before, that these are small things that can evolve with time. So with that, already shared some things in the first half, but we wanted to share just some specific, unique ideas that we really love, that are some sort of what's your grief favorites, and then some that are connected maybe to some just holidays and special days. The first one here is called Dear Photograph, and we cannot claim this idea ourselves. We did not come up with this. There's an amazing website called Dear Photograph where you can see literally thousands of these. But we do love using photography as a tool for coping with grief and remembrance. And this is a really great activity where you take an old photograph and a snapshot, one that's been printed out, a good old-fashioned photograph, and you take it back to the place where it was originally taken. And the idea of this is, taking pictures of the past in the present. So you go and you sort of line that photo up with the place that it was taken. And we've found this to be such a powerful activity for people in their grief, especially if you have photos of maybe places that were meaningful for you or specific memories of your loved one that were really meaningful. And maybe it's a place that you haven't gone back to because you're scared still about the emotions it's going to bring up. You know that it's going to be one of those moments that you're going to have to lean into feeling your feelings and know that it's probably going to be a lot. It can be a way to go back to that place with a purpose, and to go back with that photo, with that camera, and sort of have something to do that will bring that moment together. It can also be if you've been somebody who maybe there's some old photos that you've been, for the same reason, avoiding. You want to go back and look at a photo but haven't. It can be a great reason to say, you know what, I'm going to pull out that photo and I'm going to kind of do that with the purpose of taking a dear photograph with it. And if you go on their website, you can see so many. We've done this in our community as well. This was a really amazing one. I've actually pulled from the Dear Photograph website. That was from a person who traveled to Europe and found the church where his parents had been married, and was able to line up and take this photo in front of the church, which is, a great way to create a continued bond. One of the other things that we really think is important to remember is that our connection to our loved one, it's not just about the past, right? It's not just about the places that we went together or the things that we know that they loved. It's about the fact that right now, as we continue to move through the world, we are constantly interacting with things where we think, oh my gosh, if he was still here, he would have loved this, right? He would have loved this place. He would have loved this movie. He would have loved this band. He would have loved these things, even though they were things that he never lived long enough to see, or that she was never here for. So one of the things that we do on our social media, we encourage people to use the hashtag. If you use hashtags, would have loved this, but you don't have to do it publicly. You can do it privately, or you could do it on a family, if you have a family group chat, or a WhatsApp or a group text. Just to take those moments and really mark them and document them and say to yourself, oh, I'm going to take a picture of this thing that he or she would have loved. And you might just do it for yourself. You might do it to share with others. This is one that I personally took. My dad was a big fan of oyster stew, and I went somewhere that had just like absolutely the best oyster stew, and it was this great restaurant that wasn't open while he was still alive. And I thought, oh, my dad really would have loved this place. He would have loved this. He would have loved it here. So this one, somebody shared with us, this would have made him so happy, would have loved this. This one, about 7 years ago, my mom bought this bed for Spring. Spring's the dog, because it said Happy Spring on it. Springy has never been interested in it, but just now she curled up in it for the first time ever. We all miss you, Mommy. Would have loved this. And this one here, turning the tassel. I know I have posted a lot, but I haven't been in this happy in forever. I wish my mother was here to see it, but I'm just as proud, because the true test is to finish what I started without her here. She definitely passed down the strength of our ancestors, and I feel like there's no stopping me now, especially with God. What a weekend of blessings. Would have loved this. So again, using this as this moment to acknowledge that we're bringing our loved one with us into moments that they didn't get to see, but would have loved, and taking the time to share that and use that as a continued connection. Of course, incorporating loved ones into special days and thinking about what that might look like. It can look so different for different people. This is just from a post we specifically have on weddings specifically, and all the many creative things that people do, from just having photo tables out of photos of people who are no longer living, to lots of creative connections. On that blue heart on the back of that wedding dress is fabric from one of her dad's shirts that she had sewn onto the back of her wedding dress, using, old jewelry, and having all sorts of things that we have lots of ideas there, but thinking about those days and taking the time in advance to think about how one might include a loved one into some of those days. And that might be, again, special days like, family special days, but also holidays. So you might already have holiday traditions or plans for continuing bonds with your loved ones. And we would love to hear if there have been holiday traditions that you've used in the past or that you plan to use in the future. We just have a couple minutes left, so we'll share a couple ideas, and please share yours in the chat.
I actually think we were slated to go to 6:50, Lisa. So
I'm sorry. I thought we were 6:55. I apologize.
Oh, maybe I might be wrong. Let us know if you need us to stop. I just don't want to cut into the next person. So we have a few more things that relate to things like the holidays, but we also have a lot of articles on our website that talk about all these different things. So everything here can be found on our website, and we can always also share those links to be sent out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, a lot of these we've already talked about: buying the gift that you would have bought for loved ones, making recipes. We'll have links to all of these, but creating memorial albums and ornaments, and just thinking about how you can incorporate your loved one into those holidays and special days as a family. So with that, I will put our general website here in the chat, and then we'll make sure to pass along there. I think the link to these slides, and then as well, we can make sure to pass along links to some of these activities as well. And with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions, and then we'll turn back over.
And I put our email in the chat as well for if you want to email us your individual questions. So absolutely. Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate you allowing us to be a part of your conference, and just thank you so much for everybody who shared in the chat your personal experiences.
Yes, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, ladies. That went fantastic. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and take one more short break for about 10 minutes. So let's say that we will be back at 7:05 for our final speaker of the evening, and then some closing remarks. So go ahead and take 10, and we'll see you at 7:05. Okay, it's good to be back. I think we have everybody back here. Brenda Stewart is on the GAP Network Advisory Council, and she is going to introduce our third and final speaker for the evening. Brenda?
Hi there. Let us welcome Joya Alfred. Joya is an executive director at the Cornerstone of Hope Bereavement Center, which serves over 300 grieving clients a week. She is licensed by the state of Ohio as an independent social worker, and her experience includes caring for the terminally ill and their families, bereavement care services, community education, traumatic death interventions, research, graduate student supervision, and development of psychosocial components of hospice programs. Sorry about that. She holds a master's.
You don't have to read all that.
Okay.
You don't have to read all that.
Okay.
I know you were going to do that. Yeah.
Well, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And gosh, it is a snowy day here in Cleveland, so I was quite surprised this morning waking up and Mother Nature played a joke on us. But happy to be here with you tonight talking about grief, one of my favorite subjects to talk about. I work, as she mentioned, at Cornerstone of Hope, and we serve families who've had a loss. And we serve quite a bit, unfortunately, not unfortunately, we serve them, but unfortunately, we have a lot of people that have lost someone to an addiction. And they're just a favorite group of ours to work with. We love supporting them through the process. So if you know somebody or you yourself are grieving the loss of somebody to an accidental overdose or an addiction, we have tons of programming here for that. And I'm happy to, after the fact, talk to anybody via email or phone about what we can do to serve you all. So having said that, we're going to jump in and talk about, again, something that I love teaching about, which is grief and loss. And I'm just going to quickly run through the first piece of this and then really talk about how grief is affected, how it goes along with addictions and that kind of thing. So basically, grief affects 100% of us. If you have already been born, it's too late for you. You are going to die. You're going to know somebody who's died, who's had a loss. So 100% of us experience grief and loss of some sort. And so it's the thing that connects us, really, I think. Grief is not a mental health diagnosis. As much as what the DSM is trying to do with this, how can something that 100% of us experience be a mental health diagnosis? It's just not. We don't agree with that. Grief is just a natural response to loss. It is the same thing as if your nose is tickles because you got to sneeze, and the tickling is a sign that you need to sneeze. And as soon as you sneeze, the tickling goes away. It's a natural response. So the tickling in your nose, grief is a natural response to losing somebody. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is grief. The more you love somebody, the more incredibly sad you're going to be when they're gone. So even though grief is a natural response to loss, we still treat natural. We treat normal. If I had a big cut on my arm, it would bleed. That'd be normal for it to bleed. I don't just say, oh, well, it's normal, so, oh, well, no, we still treat it. I still get it stitched up or bandaged up. So even though grief is a normal process, we still treat it. And then death is a game changer for every single one of us. If you've had a loss, your life stopped a little bit in that moment that you had that loss, and then you mark time for now, forever, based on that loss. And so 10 years from now, it'll be, okay, that trip to Florida, was that before or after grandma died? It really is a line in the sand that changes your life permanently, not in a bad way. And it's going to be in a meaningful way, but it changes. It's a game changer for each of you that have experienced that. Then if we add the use of a substance or the presence of mental health diagnosis on top of that, that affects how we go through the grief process. It really does. It changes how we cope. It changes how we process. It changes how we do everything. And so we want to talk a little bit about that side as well. So one of my favorite quotes about grief is from C.S. Lewis, who said, "The pain now is part of the happiness then, that's just the deal." And so again, the opposite of love is grief. The more you love somebody, the more incredibly sad you're going to be when you lose them. And it makes sense if you think about it, right? So when people sit in my office crying, I say, what a great testimony to the relationship you have with that person. Because if you weren't devastated, that means you wouldn't have loved them a lot. So the more you love, the more incredibly hard it's going to be when that person's gone. So this is the one thing I don't like about Zoom or webinars, is that I feel like there's no audience interaction. I'm really big on that. So if we were in person, I would ask you by show of hands, how many of you have seen Martha Stewart Living? The lifestyle brand, the magazine, the TV show, and really, what does Martha Stewart help us do? Besides feel bad about ourselves because we don't do any of this stuff. But she helps us to bake cookies that are pretty. She helps us to crochet napkin rings, to do floral arrangements. She helps us to live, right? Her whole lifestyle brand is about how do I live well. There's other people that have that same type of ministry or organization, but Martha Stewart to me is the one that epitomizes like lifestyle, how do we live well? How many of you have seen Martha Stewart dying? This is cemetery gardening, where you're the fertilizer, embroidered cremation cozies, fresh flowers on your grave. It's a good thing. Clearly, none of you have seen this because I made it up. And I did it for a reason, because wouldn't it be nice if we had a journal that taught us how to lose well? Because we could talk all day about how to live and gain and climb the corporate ladder and get. But the reality is, we've already explained, 100% of us are going to lose. We're going to grieve, and yet we're raising a generation of kids that don't understand loss. And so if you go to Applebee's and the little kid has a balloon, they're 3 years old, and the balloon bursts and they start crying, what does mom typically do? Stop crying, we'll go get you another balloon, right? And when the family dog dies, what do we say? Dry up those tears, we're going to get a new puppy. We're constantly teaching children that every loss is replaceable. But guess what? Grandpa's not replaceable, is he? And so if we don't teach children how to lose well, when they're 13 and the love of their life breaks up with them and they think their world is over, they've got no emotional resources to process that kind of loss. Or when they're cut from their high school basketball team, or when they didn't make it into Harvard Law School. We all experience loss, but if we don't teach children that loss is a natural part of life, we raise kids who are entitled, who feel like this life is unfair if they have a loss. And so this is just my fun way of saying, I wish we had a journal that taught us how to lose, like we have so many that teach us how to live. Because loss is a natural part of life. So there's 4 types of losses we all experience, and we all experience all 4 of these. The first one's a developmental loss. So if you've ever tried to wean a 2-year-old from a pacifier, you know what a developmental loss is, because are they happy about it? No, they're not, right? Developmental loss is from the moment we're born to the moment we die, we experience. So it is being potty trained. It is going through adolescence and having your voice change or your body change, or you're having sexual identity issues, or just the angst of adolescence. And then it's, you know, when you get older and you have to wear reading glasses to be able to see, or your hearing goes, or you've had a stroke and you're walking with a walker. We all experience developmental loss through our whole life. The next type of loss is just some aspect of self. And those are hopes and dreams kinds of things that aren't tangible. So if I always dreamed of getting into Harvard Law School, or making it big in Hollywood, or, you know, something like that, and that didn't happen for me, at some point I have to grieve that as a loss and acknowledge that that's not going to happen. So how many young boys in Cleveland think they're going to be the next LeBron James? A lot of them. How many are really going to be? Probably none of them. But if that's a dream that you have of growing and, you know, being the next LeBron and playing in the NBA, at some point you have to acknowledge that that's not happening for you. So that's what we're talking about of hopes and dreams. And then there's just stuff. You lose your car keys, somebody steals your purse, there's just stuff. And then the last type of loss that we all deal with is death, the loss of a person. Many of us are dealing with all kinds of losses at the same time. And that's really, really difficult. It complicates things. You know, if you have a child that is addicted to a substance, and so they're an adolescent, so there's developmental stuff there. And then, you know, your dream was that they were going to grow up and become a doctor, and, you know, maybe you're losing that dream. And And again, sometimes people die from addiction. So we can be experiencing more than one type of loss at the same time. We always have to process loss first. So that's the takeaway from this slide. We always have to process loss before we can process the good things that are happening. You think about somebody that's in recovery. They have to process loss of why that loss, why that addiction started before they can fully embrace, here's the healthy new coping skills we're going to teach you so that you don't have to use a substance. It happens, I hear it all the time when people say, Mom, you're going to love this facility we're putting you in. It's amazing. And they play bingo every night there, and and they're going to take you to the mall, and there's the food's amazing. You're going to love this facility. Well, maybe Mom had a stroke. That's her developmental loss. And maybe her husband was her caregiver, but he recently passed away, so she's lost a person. And her dream was to die in her own home with a cat and dog by her side. That's some aspect of self. And then when you move to a facility, you have to sell your home to pay for the facility, so she's lost her home. So she's experiencing all four types of losses at the same time. Imagine how overwhelming that is. And yet we want to just say, Mrs. Smith, you should be just so grateful I found a spot for you in this great facility. You just need to embrace it. You're going to love it. Mom or Mrs. Smith, if you're the social worker, can't possibly embrace all those good things until we acknowledge first that there's been a loss. We always have to acknowledge that first. Same thing, I'm a foster parent. I hear social workers say all the time, you're going to love this new home we're putting you in. It's in a great school district. How many foster kids do you think care about what school district they're in? None of them do, right? They do Christmas really big at this house, and you're going to have a brother in this house, and you're going to get a new bed. And we try to get kids to embrace the fact that we're moving them one more time. But maybe I had a child who was placed with me. I was in ninth home in 7 years, never made it a year. So is there a loss of stuff, objects? Yes, because every year you're in a new bed. Every year you get a new set of clothes. Every year you're in a new school district. So there's tons of loss. He was 13 when he came to me. So there's adolescence. There's developmental losses there. His dream was to be reunited with his birth mom, which was never going to happen. He was in permanent custody, and he lost his birth dad to death. So he's experiencing all four types of losses. And yet we don't want to talk about it because it's uncomfortable. So we just say, please try and behave so this next family will adopt you. And so again, we can have the most amazing placement for him and a great family. If we don't first acknowledge loss, we just aren't going to get to that point. So hopefully I'll get off my soapbox on that now. So what is grief? Grief is the internal response to a loss. It's how you feel after you've had a loss. It's usually sadness. It's usually the angst of it. It's the butterflies in your stomach. Grief affects us physically, emotionally, and spiritually. So physically, maybe we're having headaches or belly aches, or we're not sleeping, we have insomnia. Emotionally, we're crying, we're sad, we're angry, we're feeling unforgiving. Spiritually, we're mad at God. Why did this happen? So grief affects us in every aspect of our life. But the key here is it's the internal response, how we feel about it. So can you be grieving and people not know it? Absolutely. Because unless you say, here's why I'm sad, they don't know why you're sad. Mourning is the opposite. It's the external response to a loss. And it's tied into our cultures, how we show the world that we're sad because we've lost somebody. So in the culture I belong to, how we mourn is we go to the funeral home from 2 to 4 and 7 to 9. We go back the next day and put a purple flag on our car. We drive in a line to the cemetery. We get out, we bring the casket over. We have a few words. We go back to the church and have lunch. That's how the culture I belong to, that's how we mourn. But again, I said it's tied into culture. There's a lot of Eastern European cultures that are very stoic. They have kind of a stiff upper lip. And if you said at a funeral home, Mrs. Smith, you just need to cry and let it all out, you really just messed up her grief, because that's not how they mourn. That's not how they do it. There's a lot of Latino cultures that are very demonstrative. They wail and cry. And if you said to them, Mrs. Smith, you need to sit quietly in the front row and be respectful, you just messed up their grief, right? Because mourning is how we show the world that we're sad because we've had a loss, and it's tied into our culture. So you can grieve and nobody know that why you're sad, but you cannot mourn. Mourning is externally how we show people that we've had a loss, okay? So what's our goal? The first goal is just to accept the reality of the loss, right? That seems like a simple thing. I saw a body in a casket. That's reality therapy. I accept the fact that I've had a loss. That first step takes about 1.5 years. It is a long, long process, because the first year you're just numb. You're going through the motions. I tell clients all the time, if your shoes match, you're having a great day, because it's really hard to think about and do little tasks when you're grieving. So accepting the reality of the loss means I acknowledge that difference between what my head knows to be true and what my heart doesn't want to believe. That argument between my head and my heart, that's how grief works itself out, right? So in my head, I know somebody died because I saw a body in a casket, I had a funeral, and man, I do not want to believe that this side of heaven, I'm never going to see my loved one again. So that argument back and forth is grief. And so what that looks like is if my husband died, I'm thinking, okay, he's just away on a business trip. I'm going to see him, in a couple of weeks. Or I pick up the phone to call my mom after she's passed away, and it's ringing before I realize, oh yeah, wait, I can't call my mom. That's my head and my heart arguing. Or if every day for 50 years you had 2 plates on the dinner table at 5 o'clock, because that's when your husband walked through the door for dinner, for a couple of weeks, every day at 5 o'clock, you're going to have 2 plates on the table. Again, my head knows that that's not, my husband has gone, but my heart doesn't want to believe it. So that having your head and your heart connect, in the end, your head has to win, right? Your heart wants to win, but I can't bring somebody back from the dead. So grief is a process of your heart coming into alignment with what your head knows to be true. And that process takes, like I said, about 1.5 years. It is a long, arduous, hard process. The next kind of step we're looking at is how you adjust to an environment without your loved one. Who are you now? When you are caring for an infant and your child dies of SIDS, let's say, am I still a mom? What do I do now? My dad passed away a couple of years ago, and he had Parkinson's, and my mom was a caregiver from the moment she woke up to the moment she went to bed. She was taking care of my dad. So when he died, she called me and was like, I don't know what to do. Like, she didn't know what to do all day. Figuring out who you are without your loved one, how to adjust to that new environment. That's kind of the middle step. And then the last step of grief is just when you can reinvest energy in life again. That doesn't mean if you got married that you're in another relationship. That means that that you are picking up a new hobby. You're learning to knit. You're learning to play golf. You're starting to volunteer at the hospital. You are, going to lunch with your friends. When you can reinvest energy in life, again, that's a sign that you've worked through the big chunks of the grief process. Again, figuring out that new normal. So there's some things that make how we do this differently from each other, right? There's not one right way to grieve. There's a couple wrong ways. If you are thinking of hurting yourself, clearly that's the wrong way. If you are telling me you're drinking a 5th of Jack Daniels every night, that's probably a wrong way. But other than that, there's not one right way. The whole key here is what you're doing working for you? And if it is, excuse me, we would say, excuse me, we would say keep doing it. If it's not working for you, let's figure out something different for you, right? Excuse me. So for example, Mrs. Smith will tell me, I go to the cemetery every day and talk to my husband. I was like, great. Does that work for you? Oh, yeah. It makes you feel so close to him. I can't imagine not starting my day like that. Terrific. Keep doing it. That's working for you, right? Mrs. Jones was like, oh my God, I never go to the cemetery. That's creepy to me. I talk to the picture on the mantle every morning. Great. Does that work for you? Oh, yeah. I can't imagine not starting my day that way. Terrific. Keep doing it, right? We don't have to do the same thing. We have to do what works for us. And so part of what grief counseling is about is figuring out what are those things that work for you. So having said that there's not one right way, there are some things that are distinctive about how we do this, how we go through the process. The first one's the nature of the loss. The nature of loss is what that loss means to you. All right, so the example I always give, if I went to the doctor and they said, Julia, you've got a bad heart, you should never exercise again, I would say, thank God, because I hate to exercise, right? But if you are a marathon runner and they told you you couldn't exercise, that might be devastating to you. It's the same loss. The question is, what does that loss mean to you? We grieve not only the people who died, but all the roles they had, right? So, my parents were married for 62 years. If my mom were to have died first, my dad never boiled water, never ran the dishwasher, never did a load of laundry, never did anything, because they had a very traditional marriage. So if my mom were to have died first, my dad loses not only his wife of 62 years, but he loses the cook, the maid, the housekeeper. So we grieve all the roles that people had, not just the people themselves. Coping skills, if you're somebody that gets through life, easily and you have great coping skills, you're going to get through grief better than if you don't have good coping skills. Your past experiences with death, good and bad, are going to come into play when you grieve. If your mom made you go to the funeral home when you were 6 because grandma died, and she made you kiss grandma on the cheek in the casket, and that was a little bit scary for you because her cheek was cold, the next time you go to a funeral home, even as an adult, you're going to carry a little bit of that experience in with you. Age is also a key thing to look at. The age of the person who died, of the deceased. We tend to grieve more for a child who dies than we do a senior citizen. I'm not saying that's right, but it is what it is. A 4-year-old dies, it's on the front page of the paper. Seniors die all the time in nursing facilities and hospitals. It's never in the paper. We've just assigned more value to losing a child. And again, I'm not saying that should be that way, but that's the way it is. In terms of the mourner, kids grieve very concretely, very practical. They don't always show a lot of emotion. They will come up to you and say, Grandpa doesn't have his glasses on in a casket. How's he going to see when he gets to heaven? You know, so you answer that. And they'll come back, well, why can't we go to heaven and visit Grandma? And you answer that. And so they're very concrete in how they process. Adolescents, man, they're a whole group in and of themselves. They do things differently. Teenagers don't like to talk about emotions. They do not like eye contact. If you ask a teenager, hey, how was your day? What are you going to get? Those of you who have teenagers, you know what you're going to get. Fine. You're going to get one-word answers. What we do at Cornerstone, we built a $3 million facility that has a lot of specific rooms based on type of loss. And we have areas for teens to come where we have what we call parallel play. So it's easier to ask a 16-year-old boy, how are you doing since dad died? Why are you shooting hoops with him, right? Playing basketball. We have video arcades. Teens don't like to make eye contact. They don't like talking about their feelings. So we encourage parents on your way to or from anywhere in the car where everybody's eyes are facing forward and you've eliminated that threat of intimacy by looking in their eyes, that's the best time to ask your kid about how he's doing, about how she did with her counseling session, about how her day was at school. If you expect a teenager to sit at the kitchen table with you and have a drink of pop and chips, they're not going to tell you their feelings. So we do, again, a lot of parallel play with teens. We talked a little bit about culture, how important that is. Unfinished business, if you had a huge argument with your loved one and they were killed, you know, in a car accident or something like that, you're going to have some unfinished business. Secondary losses or losses only happen because a death was a primary loss. So if there wasn't a death, you wouldn't have had any of these secondary losses. For example, if I'm married and my husband dies and I can't afford to make the house payment on just my income, I have to move to an apartment. My primary loss is my husband. My secondary loss was the loss of my home, right? Or if I was a stay-at-home mom with my kids and my husband died, now I've got to put my kids in school because I got to get a job and work. So my primary loss was my husband. My secondary loss was my kids. I had a client who it was her first marriage, but her husband's second. And amazing marriage, great relationship. And they had custody of his kids from his first marriage. And he died very suddenly, very tragically. And when that happened, the court came back in and gave the kids back to the biological mom. And so she lost the kids. And then she was late to work so many times because she was so bereaved that she couldn't get out of bed. She was late to work. She got fired from her job. And then because she didn't have a job, she couldn't make her house payment. Her home went into foreclosure and she lost her home. So in a period of 6 months, she lost her husband, her kids, her job, and her house. Like, that was everything, right? The amount of secondary losses that she had was almost greater than the original loss of her husband. So again, it's very important to look at. Sudden versus expected. This is the debate of the century in the field of bereavement. Like, which is harder, to lose somebody suddenly or lose somebody after they've been ill, let's say with cancer or ALS or something like that for a period of time? Here's the answer to that, because people ask us all. The answer is they both suck, right? I mean, really, death is just hard. It doesn't matter on some level if you lost your loved one and you got to say goodbye or you didn't, because at the end of the day, you still don't have your loved one. Having said that, there are some differences. If you have the opportunity to say goodbye, because let's say they're in a hospice situation, you can say things like, Dad, we're going to take good care of Mom. So whenever you're ready, you can let go. You know, I love you. I'm sorry I was a jerk in high school, you know, or did you hide the money in the Cayman Islands? Like, you can ask a lot of things if you have the opportunity to. But what I would say is, just because you have the opportunity to doesn't mean you're going to. I did hospice for many years, and I would have people that didn't think they were going to die. And I'm thinking, okay, you signed to do not resuscitate me. You signed all the consent forms, but they really believed there would be a cure, or that God would heal them, or that something would happen. I had a young man who was 30 who was dying, and his wife said, God's going to heal him. He's not going to die. And I'd say, terrific. I hope that happens. I really do. In the meantime, though, let's let him have his pain medicine. Nope. If he takes his pain medicine, that means he doesn't have faith and God won't heal him. And I was saying, I think God's pretty big. I think God could still heal him, even though he's taking his pain medicine. He's very uncomfortable. And he died a horribly painful death. She wouldn't let him lay in bed. She made him get up and sit on the couch. He looked like a concentration camp survivor. He was so thin, just skin and bones. At the funeral home, she says to me, because he obviously did die, Julia, nobody told me he was dying. If I had known he was dying, I would have done things so much differently. And I'm a decent human being, so I would never have said this. But what I was thinking was, oh my gosh, we told you every day. Her denial was so strong. She really believed he wasn't going to die. And so for her, if you asked her, did you expect the death to happen? She'd say, nope, totally caught off guard. Even though in my mind, you were in hospice for 6 months, you know, what were you thinking was going to be the end result? I've had people that have lost their loved ones suddenly, and I'll say, did you expect the death to happen? And they said, yeah, I did. I'm thinking, how in the world? I had a woman tell me her grandmother died of a car accident very suddenly in California. And I said, did you expect the death to happen? Yes, I did. I said, well, tell me more about that. I went to a medium and she said, something bad's going to happen to your grandmother. So when I got the call, I was like, I kind of expected that. That's weird to me, but it doesn't matter if that's weird to me. If you are processing loss as expected, even though I think it was sudden, it's not about me, it's about the client. I had a client recently, brother dropped dead of a heart attack at age 40. Did you expect the death to happen? Yes, I did. Well, tell me more about that. My dad died when he was 40 from heart disease, and I just always had this sense that my brother would die at 42. So she wasn't surprised. So she said that that was to her an expected death. The only reason that it's important to answer that question, did you expect the death to happen, is because we process grief differently based on that. So I know where to start with a client if I have the answer to that. If you have a type of death that's considered very stigmatizing, and I would say accidental overdose, the whole addiction community, very, very misunderstood, very judged, very stigmatizing. It is horrible. Suicide, we've moved a little bit the needle on that, but it's still stigmatizing. When I first started in this business, 35 years, I've been a grief counselor. AIDS was new back then. And that was you never said your son died of AIDS. You said he died of pneumonia or he died of cancer. We've moved the needle quite a bit on that, but not on some other things. So if you have a death that's stigmatizing, that's going to be a complicating factor for you. Anticipatory grief, grieving ahead of time, we talked a little bit about that. I would also say that don't judge somebody standing at the head of a casket, because I hear people say all the time, Mrs. Smith doesn't look real sad, her mom died. And I'll say, you don't know that Mrs. Smith didn't grieve a little bit every day for 5 years. She took care of her mom with Alzheimer's. So when the death happens, it's almost a relief, you know, because she's done, that wasn't really her mom. It was the shell of her mom. Her mom died long ago. So anticipatory grief, we can do some of that work ahead of time. Concurrent stresses, you could be planning a wedding and that's a happy thing, but it's a stressful thing. That's going to complicate grief that you're in. And then support system, if you feel like you have support, man, you can get through anything in life better than if you feel like you don't have support. Last one is disenfranchised grief, and that's a big fancy word. That means grief we can't talk about because it's socially negated. We can't talk about it. So what would be an example of that? If I'm having an affair with a married man and he dies, am I welcome at the funeral? No, because nobody knows who I am. I would like to clarify, though, that I'm not, because I did this one time and somebody wrote in the evaluations, you should never have affairs with married men. So now I clarify, just an example, I'm not having an affair. Abortion is another very misunderstood type of loss. People say, well, you picked that, so why are you sad? It's a devastating loss for people, it really is. Ariel Castro's mom, right? I mean, he was a horrible individual, but at the end of the day, there's a mom who lost a son, and there's a legitimate grief in that. Where does she go in Cleveland for counseling and support with her last name Castro, right? Disenfranchised grief is grief that we can't talk about it because it's socially negated. So, and I'm going to start flying out because we're going to run out of time. What are the goals of grief care? The goal is never to get over it, because you don't ever get over people. You could get over somebody stealing your purse. You don't get over people. You learn to live without them. So the goal is, how do I live without this loved one in my life? Another way of saying is, how do I remember with less pain? Because first, when somebody dies and we think about them, oh, it's so painful. We think about them laying in the hospital bed with tubes. It is very painful. When we can remember somebody and think about them and remember dancing at our wedding or something fun, that's a sign that you've worked through a lot of the process, but you don't get over people. You learn to live without them. Denial. Denial is something that we all have, every single one of us. And if you tell me you don't have denial, you're proving my point to me, because you do. The normal denial for us is things like, if I hit the snooze button one more time, you know, I can still be to work on time. Or, gosh, the dryer is shrinking my pants again. What is that about, right? We all have denial. For the bereaved, they're going to make statements and they're going to say things that sound like denial, but they really aren't. So what I mean by that, denial is a life-saving skill when you're grieving. If you lost your loved one in such a horrific way, to think about that is so painful that it's just easier sometimes to let your minds think something differently, right? And nobody can be sad 24 hours a day forever. You have to take breaks. If you lost your loved one and you have a 4-year-old son and it's December 1st, guess what? They still want Santa Claus to come. You got to put your big girl pants on and put up a Christmas tree. You have to engage back in life. And how we do that sometimes is by making statements that sound like denial. If you have to go back to, if you're a nurse in a hospital passing meds, you got to have your head in the game, right? And how we do that is we pretend like we're okay. So that looks like denial, but it really isn't. So now it's a life-saving skill for somebody who's bereaved. And what we say is an evasion from the new reality being a life without my loved one, is not the same thing as denial. Alan Mopelt said that evasion from the new reality is not denial. I have a client who lost her son in the current conflict in Afghanistan, stepped on a landmine, and he was 20, I think. And when that happens, they take your DNA now when you go to combat because of all the IEDs, body parts are blown about, and they found his head, his torso, and one arm. They mailed it back, and she had a funeral. A couple days later, they found his feet still intact in his boots, and they send them back to her. They dug up the casket. They put the feet in. They had another funeral. 4 times. 4 times they had a funeral because they kept finding body parts. The 5th thing they found was a finger, and she couldn't wear it. She said, I can't have one more funeral. So she had it cremated. She wore it in a locket around her neck. This was several years ago. And she would come every week to her counseling appointment with me, and she would say nothing. The whole session, she sat for an hour. I didn't say anything, and she did not one word. And sometimes there's not a lot of counseling that goes on in my office. Sometimes it's just about holding somebody's pain for them for a little bit, just to give them a break, because it's hard to do this work. It's hard to carry that level of grief for a long time. So if that's what I can do is just hold that pain for you for an hour and give you a break, I'm good with that, right? But at the end of every session, every week she said the same thing. She would get up, put her coat on, and she'd say, he's deployed, I'll see him at the end of the year. Denial. Is that denial? No. Does she know her son's dead? Yes, she's buried him 5 times. She knows. But it's too painful to think that my son was stepped on a bomb, was blown apart. And like, who wants to think that? So it's just safer and easier sometimes to let your mind play a trick on you. It's easier to say, my son's away at college, I'll see him at the end of the semester. My husband's on a business trip, I'll see him at the end of the year. We never, ever argue with that. And if you're working with somebody, don't ever argue. It's like arguing with somebody who has Alzheimer's. If they say the sky's purple polka dots, is there really any point in saying, no, it's not, it's blue? First of all, they don't know. And who cares if they think it's purple polka dots? You know, it's not about me wanting to be right to tell them it's blue. It's about that's what they need to do right now. And so for somebody who's grieving, if that's what they need to do, man, we let them have it every single time because it really is a life-saving skill for them. So here's how we want grief to work. We want to start on the left, make a beeline to right, and be done. That's what grief really looks like, right? I very often ask clients to describe that feeling. Like, what is that? That big tangled ball of emotions. Another way of looking at in that, like just splat, it's difficult. Another way of looking at it is I'm going to get on my bike, make a checkered beeline to the checkered finish. And that's the reality of grief. What that looks like is that you fall in the ocean and there's rocks and mountains and hills. And then again, add an addiction to that, and it just complicates things even more. So people ask me all the time, does it get any easier? And I'm all about telling people the truth, even the hard truth, because I believe we can do anything if we have the truth, right? So if the doctor said, you know, can you care for your mom? It's going to be about 2 weeks, and then, you know, then you're going to be done. Most of us would say, okay, for 2 weeks, I could put my job aside. I can take time off or whatever. But if the doctor said, maybe a year, maybe 10 years. Now I don't know if I can commit, right? If you have the truth, if you know what the end is going to be, you can do anything. I feel like you can face anything in life. So when people say, does it get better? I say, no, it does not get better. It gets different, right? First thing I say when I meet people when they come to Cornerstone is, I'm so nice to meet you. I'm so sorry I have to. Because if I have to meet you, that means if you're here, it's because you've had a loss. So it's all about, here's what it looks like. It doesn't get better, it gets different. If the black dot is my grief and I'm the green container, this is what people want to see happen. They want to see that black dot get smaller and smaller over time. I don't think that's what happens. I think this is what happens. I think our grief stays the same but our capacity to hold it gets bigger, right? So grief doesn't go away. It's always with us, but our capacity to process it and hold it and feel it is what changes and gets bigger. So initially, people who were bereaved say it's like right here in your face. You could barely breathe. But at some point, the grief slides right over and it's tucked away neatly by your ear, and you can function in life again. But man, you hear the song that you dance to at your weddings or right back in your face, and you cry and you process it and it gets tucked away again. And then a few days later, maybe you passed your favorite restaurant you used to go to, and it's right back in your face, and you process grief and it gets tucked away. So that grief doesn't diminish and go away. I think the grief stays the same, but I think our capacity to hold it, to process it, that's what changes, okay? So we talked about there's not one right way to do grief. I am going to just skip a couple of these slides just because in lieu of time, we're not going to get through it all. So are you happy? Yes or no? If you say yes, you're happy, great, keep doing what you're doing. You're probably not sitting in my office. So if you're happy, if you don't want, if you are not happy, the next question is, do you want to be? If the answer is no, keep doing what you're doing because you're not happy. But if you do want to be happy, you have to change something. And these are people who are kind of stuck in their grief. There's always a reason people get stuck, and we have to find out why that is to unstick them. Growth is painful, change is painful, but nothing is as painful as staying stuck somewhere you don't belong. Whether that's with an addiction, whether that's with a mental health issue, excuse me, or whether that's with grief, staying where you are is usually not the good thing. Growth is painful, but it's not as painful as staying where you don't belong. I'm a big fan of The Big Bang Theory. If you don't know, it's a great show about a bunch of scientists with Asperger's. They don't say that, but they are. They're brilliant, but they don't have a lot of social skills. But the one character, the main character, Sheldon, they said to him one time, Sheldon, you need to get out of your comfort zone. And he says, why? They call it a comfort zone for a reason. It's really comfortable here, right? The magic always happens outside of your comfort zone. And I would also say the grief resolution always happens outside of your comfort zone. And I might even venture to say the addiction recovery also happens outside your comfort zone. Because where we're comfortable, it's the sameness, it's the same unhealthy coping skills, it's the same unhealthy way of processing, it's the same addiction, it's the same all that. Everything good that's going to happen is going to happen outside your comfort zone. So it's a process of getting people outside their comfort zone. The treatment of the wound gets determines whether time brings healing or hate. I said if I started by saying if I had a cut on my arm, would it bleed? Yes. I could pull my sleeve down and pretend that cut goes away and it gets better, and it might, but it also might not. And if it doesn't, now it gets infected. Now it's painful. Now I got to have it cleaned out, or I got to have stitches, or if I get gangrene, my arm gets amputated, right? So the treatment I give that wound determines whether I keep my arm. It's the same thing in our grief. The treatment, and I would say the same thing, with our addictions. The treatment that we give this determines what happens. It determines whether time brings healing or hate. 85% of men on death row lost a parent early in childhood. 85%. Makes you wonder if the trajectory of their life could have been different had somebody paid attention to that grief. Okay, so there's a lot of urban areas in Cleveland where you watch your 13-year-old cousin get shot in a gang drive-by shooting. You have two choices now, right? Pick up a gun and retaliate, or go get grief counseling. And the second isn't always happening partly because it's not available. But the trajectory of a kid's life could be different. Could there be some support? I would say the same thing in addiction recovery. The trajectory, we could change a lot of this if we could talk about grief. We work a lot with some of the addiction facilities here in Cleveland, love doing that. And there's a lot of people that have an addiction that had a horrific loss, like really, really painful things we hear about, sort of suicide, murder situations. And how do you begin to process that kind of pain that somebody says to you, you take this substance that makes all those bad feelings go away. And guess what? They are right, it does. But now you're addicted. And so you're in and out of treatment facilities, but nobody's talking about why. We're talking about the grief that happened. If we could do that, I believe we could change the recidivism rate in some of these facilities. So important to talk about loss. That's why I started with that. A couple things about grief and addictions. Alcohol is the anesthesia by which we endure the operation of life. Life is hard. And if we numb some of it with alcohol or a substance, it's understandable, but it's not ever the way that's going to get you through it. The first thing you put ahead of your sobriety will be the second thing that you lose. And so, one thing that seems to be popular is as human beings, we usually don't like to feel pain. Another thing that seems to be true is that substances generally do a good job of numbing the pain, So grief can be seen as an appropriate time to take advantage of their pain numbing effects. When we have emotional pain, if we take a substance, man, whew, that takes care of that pain for a little bit of a time. But again, not obviously clearly the healthiest way to take care of that. Unresolved grief and loss frequently accompany people through the process of moving from the culture of addiction to the culture of recovery. There's a lot of grief and loss that happens as you are becoming clean and sober. If you are trying to stay clean and sober, you probably have to not hang out with your buddies that you hung out with before that maybe aren't trying to be clean and sober. And so you've lost your friends, your support system. You've lost the way you coped. If you coped by taking a substance and now we take that coping skill away, we expect you to be okay. No, we got to teach you new coping skills, right? So loss and grief frequently accompany this process of addiction recovery. Denial and addiction is very real, not the same that we were talking about before. That I don't have a problem, I can manage my alcoholism. That's denial. That's denial. And again, addiction makes people absent from their own lives. So once you become clean and sober, we have people that had a loss 20 years ago and they never process it because they were using a substance. And now it's like, ooh, that wound is so raw and fresh because they're just beginning to process it for the first time. Okay. Addiction can cause depression, but depression does not cause addiction. And I'm sorry, I think we have like 5 minutes. So I'm just going to start running through these quickly. Practical applications: identify coping that does not come in a pill or bottle, obviously. Create healthy support systems. You guys know all this. Acknowledge the reality that when you're grieving and you're trying to stay clean and sober, you're going to feel things you haven't felt maybe for a long time. And that's a really hard thing to do. Seek professional support around grief as well as recovery. So when somebody has an addiction and they come to us because they've had a loss, we say 1,000% we're with you. We're going to talk about the loss, but you have to simultaneously be seeing somebody for the addiction, because that's not what we do. We stay in our lane. Our lane is grief because somebody died. We're not in the lane of other things. And so we want you to simultaneously be working on your addiction, because I could be doing my best work with you as a clinician. It doesn't matter if you're going to go home and use a substance to cope, because you're not going to get well. Okay? Developing new ways to cope. Know your triggers and have a plan. Grief triggers can quickly become relapse triggers, because all of a sudden you're having a bad day because you're missing your loved ones so much that easily becomes a relapse trigger for you. So really important to take care of that. Just a couple things about mental health. We talked about grief's not a mental health issue. I have a love-hate relationship with a DSM, mostly hate. Suicidal versus expected statement. So when people say things like, I just want to go be with my husband, I love to just go to heaven and be with them, that we don't count that as a suicidal statement. If they say, I can't imagine going on without my loved one, those are just normal grief conversations that we have, and we expect that. So we would never say that that person is suicidal. So it's just important to know the difference. National Institute of Mental Health did a grant. The estimated incidence of prolonged intense grief in the general population is only 11 to 15%, but of the people that had psychiatric issues, it was much higher, much higher. Practical stuff, a lot of these are very similar. We treat trauma before we treat grief always. So if there's a trauma in the addiction or the mental health issue, we treat that first. If your loved one was murdered, we treat that trauma before we treat the grief, right? There's lots of trauma treatments. We'll go through all these. We always assess for suicidality. And then this is the last, and then I will stop and see what questions that you might have. This is the picture I put usually at the end of most of my presentations because I love the visual of it. It's hard to see a little bit. It's raining only on the person on the left. And think about, it's like those Ziggy cartoons where sunshine and rainbows over everybody else, but Ziggy has a rain cloud. A lot of the people a lot of the interns that we have working here at Cornerstone, they'll say, oh, I want to take their suffering away, because it's really, really hard to run a murder loss support group when you sit and hear 14 graphic murder stories. Like you just want to take their pain away. Or somebody's child has an addiction and they're in our accidental overdose. Like you want to take the pain away, because it's really hard to be present in the moment for really, really deep, heavy stuff. But the last I checked, I will tell them, you are not God, and you don't have any ability to do that. I also believe there's a purpose for suffering. I don't pretend to know what that is for anybody. I don't even know what it is for me. But I believe that suffering can be used to strengthen people, to build character down the road, not right away. We don't talk about that ever right away. But think about if it's raining on the person on the left, what can I do to help them? I can hand them an umbrella, right? So now the rain's not beating on their head. Now the rain's beating on the umbrella. But can I make the rain stop? No, because I'm not God. I can't make the rain go away. I can't make suffering go away for people, but I can hand them an umbrella, meaning I can give them the tools, spiritually speaking, emotionally speaking, to cope with the suffering, to lessen the effect of the suffering, to bring meaning behind the suffering. But I can't make the suffering go away because I'm not God. So I see our role as helpers, as professionals, is to just be umbrella passer outers, to give people umbrellas, give them the tools they need to deal with that. And if I don't have an umbrella to give them, I must stand in the rain with them. Because at the end of the day, it's about connection. That's what it's all about for all of us. So I will end there and see if there's any questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, see if there's anybody has any questions, comments. Okay. Well, you can reach me at cornerstoneofhope.org if anybody has any questions after the fact, or if I can help you with any of your clients or yourself, I'd love to do that. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Julia. I really appreciate your time. At this time, we're getting ready to conclude for the evening, and we are going to hear from the Deputy Executive Director from Prevention Action Alliance, and his name is Bobby Persinger, and he is going to bring our conference to a close tonight. I want to invite everybody back at tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for another day of outstanding speakers, and we hope you will join us then. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Bobby, and he will be sharing a few comments, and then he will close for this evening.
Well, thank you, Gretchen, and I'm happy to bring our evening to a close and day one of the GAP conference to an end. But I will echo Gretchen's comments and say, please don't forget to rejoin us tomorrow morning for part two, because it's bound to be equally as wonderful. A couple things I will remind you. Lauren will put the evaluation link in the chat box as we're winding down our evening. Please do not forget to fill that out. Let us know what you think of our event and our speakers. And I will say that I appreciated all of them this evening as they shared with us their understanding and their knowledge and their skills. One of the things that kind of stuck out to me was I'm one of those people that I hear music playing in my head when people talk. So all evening long, I heard a couple songs play. One, in the beginning, the fabulous Tina Turner song of What's Love Got to Do with It? And I think the answer that we got tonight is that it's got everything to do with it. And that the second song is the Beatles song, All We Need Is Love. And I think the wonderful experience of those practical things that Eleanor and Lisa and Julia all shared with us is that if we come at everything with love and sharing the love that we have for folks, whether we get to see them every day in person or whether we share love with folks that we see in our heart on a regular basis, that's the most important part. And lastly, I love that last little graphic of Julia's, because as a young child, I was prone to enjoying thunderstorms. And I was one of those kids that when the thunder and the lightning would start to put on a show, I would run to the door and look outside. And one of the things that I loved about thunderstorms was at the end of them, there's always a rainbow. And it reminded me of the Maya Angelou poem about being a rainbow in somebody's cloud. So I hope that this evening helped to produce a rainbow in any cloud that you may be experiencing. And my challenge to you as we move on through the evening and tomorrow is to be that rainbow in somebody else's cloud, whether it's a kind gesture, a smile, or being able to support them as they are grieving. One of the things that the GAP Network does is offers that opportunities, and visiting our website can get you to access to those resources and can help you to be that rainbow in somebody's cloud. So thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to tomorrow If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us here at Prevention Action Alliance. Have a good evening and good night, everybody.